In 1992, Lucinda Vardey, a successful Toronto literary agent, purchased a 600-year-old derelict farm in the hills of Tuscany. Hills once walked by St. Francis of Assisi. Lucinda and her husband John Della Costa resurrected this ancient pilgrim stop, opening a monastic retreat center that has transformed them, the hundreds who have stayed there, and an entire valley. "800 years ago, in the time of St. Francis of Assisi, it wasn't uncommon to see devoted worshippers walking through the hills of Tuscany on spiritual pilgrimage to Rome. For the last 14 summers, two modern-day pilgrims, writers Lucinda Vardey and John Della Costa, have made the journey from their home in Toronto to their retreat on the Umbrian border 100 kilometers from Florence. They aren't the first pilgrims to find their way to Migliara.
The name Migliara is a derivative, really, of the word mille, which means 1,000 in Italian. And it comes from, we found out later, from the fact that this was always a pilgrim's rest, even from the Etruscan times, and it took 1,000 steps to go to an altar, a pagan altar, a worship altar at the top of the hill behind. And then subsequent to that, it became a Christian pilgrim's rest, where St. Francis probably could have visited, and St. Anthony on their way to Rimini to the coast, over the mountains. And so it was always a pilgrim's rest.
When Lucinda first had the idea of creating a retreat center here, we basically believed that our job was going to be to restore the property, to beautify it, to make it interesting for people. But as we got here and as we encountered the ancient aspect of the land, we recognized that what we were really doing was reverse engineering. We were returning it to a place where it's beautiful on its own. It's not what we do to it, but it's what we allow it to do to us.
This isn't a garden that you feast your eye on particularly. It's an interior feasting. It's a feast that comes from the peace that nourishes the soul.
In the early 1990s, Lucinda, a self-confessed workaholic who ran her own Toronto literary agency, was looking for nourishment for her soul. Her spiritual yearning had already led her to yoga, Hindu scriptures, Buddhist meditation, Gestalt therapy, and back to Catholicism. But change only comes when we're still enough to listen.
I was called by St. Francis to come here. I was in bed with the flu in Toronto, and a number of sequences happened to make it very clear that he was speaking to me. And one of them was that I found a little copy by the bed of the little flowers of St. Francis, which my grandmother had given me, and I hadn't noticed it before. And it's always the way I feel with God, is that it's usually right in front of us and we see it at the right time. And so I was told in prayer to come and buy a property and open it for other souls to experience a new way of spirit, which would be a spirit of the land, a spirit steeped in Franciscan spirituality with its roots in Italy. And this seemed to be the answer to a bit of a dry period, that this is what I was meant to do. So when I got better, I booked a ticket straight away, because one of the things that happens is when you get a revelation, or I find in my experience when you get a revelation, you know, a reasoning side of you can come in and say, well, what sort of madness is this, and why would you do that, and all those things. But what I found was that you have to just go into action and trust that what you've been given and what I had been given was really a truth. So I booked a plane ticket and I went into Rome, and I was reading a biography of St. Francis by Julian Green, where he was becoming more and more alive for me as a real person. And it was very moving. There was something hypnotic about his life, mythic about his life, that had touched my soul in my own myth and story. And I was told to just follow the birds. I did have a real estate person help me, an Englishman, and he drove me first down this lane, and 2 wood pigeons flew ahead of the car, and so I remembered to follow the birds. And when I arrived here, we got out of the car, and just over the animal troughs was a picture of St. Francis of Assisi, and I said, this is it, that's the sign.
After years of abuse, the property was in rough shape, but for Lucinda, there was beauty and a sense of belonging.
I had no idea how it was going to come together, yet I knew deep down it was the right thing. My rational side said, how can you afford this? And my soul said, how can you not afford it?
Miliara, the retreat center owned by Lucinda Vardey and John Della Costa, has no formal garden. The fields lie fallow. After centuries of cultivation, the land is being allowed to rest.
In the theology that comes out of the story of the Garden of Eden, the garden is given to us by God in a perfect form, and it's up to us to preserve it as it is. It's not about decorating. It's not about looking good. It's not about when some die and others come out. It's really about what does the garden want to do and what is happening that I can tend and be obedient to.
The Miliara that Lucinda found in 1992 was desperately in need of tending. Abandoned for decades, the 600-year-old house had been heavily vandalized. But the building wasn't the only victim.
The land itself had been used as common property for about 20 years. We had hunters who would arrive here once hunting season started and just take over as if they owned the property.
I mean, the first day of the hunt was like a scene from Apocalypse Now. I mean, guys with guns and jeeps came onto the land. I was so shocked it was the first year.
And Lucinda, sometimes straight out of prayer, still in her dressing gown, would go down to the field and begin to challenge the hunters, but from the perspective of St. Francis. And most of the time they didn't understand her, but they were often very fearful of this eccentric English woman who was telling them in very passionate language that they needed to put their rifles away.
The battle to end centuries of hunting on their land was just the beginning of Lucinda and John's struggle to bring Miliara back to life.
We thought we were creating a pilgrim stop for people. Well, we had to go through our own pilgrimage of restoration and renovation. And that meant everything from dealing with the bureaucracy of a foreign country where getting permits and approvals can be quite a long, lengthy, tedious process, to dealing with contractors who operate in a very different fashion than we do in North America.
There was a farmer that used a very primitive watering machine that he used to plant outside our window here and go on for 19 hours watering his field. And we couldn't reason with him, and those sort of struggles that taught us patience, but also taught us how to be in a different culture to enable non-violence to live. In the shamanic tradition, a place has spirit in everything, and this is what St. Francis taught. The trees that have stood for centuries tell stories. The stones hold abuse. After having so much violence here, it took us about 7 years to cure the violence. So we had to practice non-violence on the land, which included not killing a fly, not killing an ant, not killing any living thing.
The space has eventually become safe enough that the animals have returned. The plants thrive, and what we've seen is that in that enclosure, people too, when they come here on retreat, thrive.
We have been given back 100-fold without ever using fertilizer, without ever using any chemicals. There's no chemicals used on the land. Everything has become abundant simply by us practicing prayer, peace, and non-violence. Perfect.
It wasn't only human violence that tested Lucinda and John's resolve. The Assisi earthquake of 1997 caused major structural damage. Lucinda, alone at the time, was forced to sleep in the fields. The house was in need of extensive and costly repairs.
We had to discern and re-establish ourselves, and somehow or other, as soon as we had done all the limestone work and there was dust everywhere, we were on all fours with toothbrushes trying to get the dust out of these hundreds of tiles we have. When we finished the work, we began to feel more love from Miliara. We felt that we were her tenders in a more deeply committed way than we had previously, and therefore, like all love, it started to deepen.
One of the privileges of our property is that we have a natural spring that just is bountiful, overflowing with water all the time. Our neighbors, just up the laneway, have been without water and had been trying for many years, petitioning previous owners for access to that water. And we made the decision to share the water, which was a revolutionary step for this valley. There had been previous battles over the water, and eventually that story got out. And it was part of how we were actually accepted in this community, that we decided that generosity was part of this property and that we wanted to share the abundance of what we had.
There's many times when we've nearly given up here with the challenges, natural and otherwise, that have come to us. But now, just last year, our prayers for peace in this valley came to real fruition, and a no hunting zone was officially made for this whole little area here. And so we could see again God's hand. In all the great spiritual traditions, we're taught that if you're the peace that you want to be in the world, or if you live what you want to be in the world, then the world will be that. So I like to think that John and I have contributed to a little bit less of violence that is so much a part of our world today, just by practicing this with an ant, and therefore maybe affecting a valley that maybe affect a country, and that may be finally affect a planet.
Two years after Lucinda was called to Miliara, she and John were married at the Hermitage of Monte Casale, established in the 12th century by St. Francis. Along with Miliara, Lucinda and John consider this tiny, humble hermitage to be their spiritual home.
Monte Casale is high up the mountain, and we're on almost like a song line directly in the valley below. Being only 20 minutes away from us, we can come here in the afternoon and meditate and pray, which we do quite regularly. Like we can have our own retreat by coming to one of the holiest places in the world. This is St. Francis's garden. Here it says Orto, little garden di Francesco. I suppose personally, I'm always a little suspicious of the perfect garden with no weeds. And I sort of just love the imperfection of nature, if you like.
After the Garden of Eden, when through sinfulness we brought contamination into the world, we end up with a reality where we have beautiful flowers, but we also have weeds. And the monks here grow their garden with not a lot of discipline. They live off of this garden, they relish these flowers, but it's not about creating a perfect sphere. That's what lives in heaven. What we do here is we live in the garden of the earth.
A monastic life is about work, creativity, whatever it is, the gifts that you've been given. Prayer, silence, contemplation, and out of that contemplation, the action of helping and serving others. We try. We're not perfect and we're not able to do this all the time. But we get up in the morning with the intention of doing this, to ask for the grace of doing this. And we have opened the doors of this place to whoever feels called to come. It's hard work. It's not easy work, but the rewards are more than the effort.
When people arrive, they've already taken a risk coming here. But almost as soon as they arrive, once the gate closes and they're in the space, you can just see a movement of relief. They come into a place of peace and it begins to speak to them and it just allows them to be. Usually, as they become oriented to the space and they walk the perimeter of the property, they begin to get a sense of how protected they are here, and that enclosed reality creates the opportunity for them to really pay attention to their hearts, to really give voice to their souls. People sit down with their journals and begin to compose poetry and prayers. Others sit out in the garden and begin to do watercolors or line drawings.
I come from a family of writers and artists, and I have found great inspiration here, great peace, of constant peace, to be able to create ideas into words and to be able to pray them alive. I've had some training as a therapist, and one of the things we always learned in group was that there are always problems. There's always somebody who, and someone who will try and break up, and this is how to deal with it and all. And I was also prepared for this when I began giving retreats here, and none of that ever happened. None of it ever happened. It was like family. Everybody who came was always family. We've had Jewish people here, we've had Buddhist people here. The Buddhist people have been wonderful to remind us all of mindfulness. At one point I used to get annoyed with the goats and the shepherd shouting at the goats. And then the Buddhist who came here just reminded us to be mindful of even the old goat and even the old, So we all learn from each other. Most sacred places that honor the land have some form of labyrinth or spiral. And had a group of women staying here on retreat. We decided at the end of the retreat to ritualize. It's always good to ritualize things. We always ritualize them on the land. We've ritualized people's transformation in thunderstorms, standing naked in the stream. There's all sort of, and all the images I remember, they just live with me.
The ritual was for the women of Afghanistan and took place on 9/11. At the very moment the Twin Towers were under attack in New York.
We completed the ritual, and then we came in and John broke the news to us, and we realized the miracle of the timing of what we had done, that we had contributed through prayer a little bit of light to a very dark time. It's in the small details of the natural world that we see the wonders of God. It's the little things, I find, is where the greatest joy is, in life as well as in this field. This morning I noticed this extraordinary, exquisite Queen Anne's lace just by the heavenly path, and thanking it for its presence, I noticed that it had a little white insect on it. Everything belongs in God's plan.
Anyone who stays at Migliara finds fresh herbs and flowers from the field by their bedside. It's Lucinda's special welcoming touch, reminding visitors that even inside, they're connected to the land.
All the senses are opened and nourished by Mother Nature, with herbs particularly. so that in the end the whole little herbal bundle is beautiful to the sight, it's beautiful to the taste, and it's wonderful for its smell.
This year, Lucinda and John are on sabbatical. It's the first year they haven't held the retreat. Like the time she was called here by St. Francis, Lucinda is ill. But rather than letting her illness defeat her, she and John are listening to Milyara.
Any creativity involves breaking through, giving something up to try something new. And often we don't know what that is going to be. But we come here, and through prayer and through reflection, we learn what it is that our souls actually need, and that becomes the work that we do.
If I'm still enough in prayer, then it's amazing what can come and greet me. So I have learnt that stillness and receptivity to the land has enabled the beauty of the wild life to become one with who I am at the deepest part of myself, and also teach how to lead a simple, beautiful life for God. So for me, the prayer of receptivity and gratitude, I think, are the core of the theology of living in a little corner of paradise, which is what this is.